Welcome to Two Quants and a Financial Planner, where we bridge the worlds of investing and financial planning to help investors achieve their long-term goals. Join Matt Ziegler, Jack Forehand, and me, Justin Carbonell, as we cover a wide range of investing and planning topics that impact all of us and discuss how we can apply them in the real world to achieve the best outcomes in our financial lives.
Justin Carbonell and Jack Forehand are principals at Validity Capital Management. Matt Ziegler is managing director at Sunpoint Investments. The opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Validity Capital or Sunpoint Investments. No information on this podcast should be construed as investment advice. Securities discussed in the podcast may be holdings of clients of Validity Capital or Sunpoint Investments.
Jess, thank you for joining us.
All right. Thanks for having me here, guys.
I should give you a proper introduction before we get going here. You know, people are used to me, Matt, and Justin. We're joined today by Jess Bost. She's the VP of Strategic Partnerships and Client Success at Alpha Architect. And what I really like about what you do is you kind of combine what I do with what Matt does. You're on the factor investing side, but you're also on the financial planning side. So, if we ever need a one-person show to host this podcast and Matt and I need to be eliminated, you would be the perfect person to bring in to kind of bridge that gap.
Oh, that's a wonderful introduction. I like to call myself a woman of the people. In that I am not native to the quant world, and really not even native to the advisory world, but I do understand people, and I understand that these are very important topics for them to be able to grapple with and understand in a meaningful way for their lives so they can build wealth. And so thank you for having me here.
Yeah, Woman of the people is far superior to Jack's impression as Jess as Terminator. So thank you for saying we can survive this.
We can.
And Woman of the People also gets into what we're going to do, what we're talking about today, because, when people see this idea of, I know whenever there's a tweet on Twitter and it's like Fama in French, I expect some crazy formula to be like the first thing in there. And then it just gets more complicated from there. And I have no idea what's going on. And you went the exact opposite direction here. You wrote a great, 20 principle tweet of things we can learn from Fama in French. And you did it in a way your average person can actually understand, which almost never happens with Fama in French. So today what we're going to do is we're going to go through, 10 or 11 or as many as we can get through of those points. And we're going to maybe talk about how we can explain these in a more understandable way for investors and then some things we can learn from it.
Sure.
So we'll have you at a high level explaining it. We'll have me boring people to death with a quant definition after and basically undoing everything you've done. And then we'll have Matt explaining how the work of Skid Row and 80s metal will explain all of this to your average person. So
buckle up.
Yeah, exactly. So Matt, I look forward to Fama and the Youth Gone Wild, how you're going to bring those two together.
Mission accepted.
Thanks.
Okay.
Let's do it. Jump in.
But to get into it, we're going to start with something that, sounds pretty complicated on the surface, but really is not. And you did a great job in your tweet of explaining it. And it's this idea of efficient markets and the efficient market hypothesis. And, just to show how people can make this complicated, I went and found an academic paper to bring us in here. And I read I'm going to read the definition. So the definition of the efficient market hypothesis is the primary role of the capital market is allocation of ownership of the economy's stock. In general terms, the ideal is a market in which prices provide accurate signals for resource allocation. That is a market in which firms can make production investment decisions and investors can choose among the securities that represent ownership of firms' activities under the assumption that security prices at any time fully reflect all available information. A market in which prices all fully reflect available information is called efficient. So I have no idea what I just read. Which is why I want to have you on and you can explain this. So can you just, for your average person, can you explain what the efficient market hypothesis is?
Yeah, well, first of all, there's no better way to tell somebody that they don't belong here than to give them that kind of a definition to a term. So I appreciate you calling that out. And also the thing about the financial markets is there is a lot of information that we don't know at the surface level. But the problem is that those pieces really are known. And so the efficient market hypothesis is just about recognizing, realizing, stating that the majority of the things to know about the market are actually known. You may not individually know them, but they are known. And that actually impacts the investment price when all of those variables can be known. So that's really the bottom line of the efficient market hypothesis. Even if you don't personally know it, those things are known. That is baked into the price of the stock that you're looking at.
And it's such a dangerous thing because I always want to think I know stuff that everybody else doesn't know. And I want to think I can profit from that stuff.
Yeah.
And, all of us think that. But like when you think about the collective market, I always like to look at this as thinking about the smartest investors I know. I mean, you work with Wes Gray. He would be right at the top of that list. If I think about all those people and all their knowledge and them coming together to make a market,
yes,
how am I going to know more than them? And that's the way, like, whenever I have the tendency to think I know something, that's maybe not reflected in market prices. I always go back to that and try to think about those types of people.
Yeah. The idea, I mean, the example that I used, which just for me seemed to help just distill this down to something that everybody could understand, was just the idea of playing Go Fish with your friends. So if you are playing Go Fish, the idea behind the game is you don't know what your friends have in their hands. And so therefore it could give you an advantage if you can figure that out without them knowing that you figured it out, because then you're asking for things that you know are there. And that gives you some competitive advantage within the game. If you're playing Go Fish with all of your cards laid out, everybody has all their cards laid out on the table, there really is no competitive advantage there. And so that, the description of the efficient market hypothesis is that everybody has all of their cards laid on the table. So again, you're playing a game. You may know all the rules, but everybody else does too. You may think you have all the information. They also have it too. There's really no way to gain an advantage in that scenario.
It's really interesting to think about this in the way you just explained it and how it maps over the parts of life that make sense and the parts of life that don't make sense. I'm a big fan of approaching at least this part of the very textbooky definition with, if I walk into the grocery store and I'm amongst my friends, the produce, and I say there's fruit salad for sale and there's fruit for sale, the efficient markets hypothesis says I should be able to look at the prices of the fruits, the prices of the fruit salad, guess at the labor cost of the people making the fruit salad, and come to a natural conclusion because we all have the same information.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe this is like the ultimate lesson of the efficient markets hypothesis, is that like, it's just fruit salad. You can look at it. It's useful to understand why in concept this should make sense. But out here in the real world, this is one of those things that even if it exists for a brief moment in time, we are right to question this whole thing.
Yeah, and I was on the Go Fish thing. My 9-year-old consistently beats me at Go Fish, and so I was thinking I need to be in favor of the efficient market hypothesis. I need to turn the cards over, and then
Is your
I got a much better
9-year-old
shot.
Warren
You win
Buffett?
more.
Yeah.
Yeah, it works in my favor. But I think this kind of leads well into the next thing we're going to talk about, which is the different levels of market efficiency. And this is where it can get a little bit even more complicated for people. You've got the strong form, the semi-strong form, the weak form. And you had a good way too to break this kind of stuff down and make it a little more understandable.
Yeah, thanks. These ideas, right? They get so ethereal, and it's really hard to bring them down to some kind of tangible piece that goes, oh, that makes sense to me. I can map that back over. And so that's really sometimes the fun part of an investment conversation when you get down to the client level, is just giving them something that makes sense to them that may not be market related at all, that they can then transfer back over to feel like they've wrestled with and come to some conclusion that's meaningful to them with their portfolio. So this one for me was like, if you're imagining the market's like a giant puzzle. So the strong form of the market would be like you have really big puzzle pieces. And even without putting the puzzle together, you can kind of sort of see how the puzzle's going to look. With the semi-strong, it's like having maybe that 150 piece puzzle. It's like you don't really know yet what it's going to come together, but you have an idea of the landscape. You probably know just by glancing at the pieces, whether it's a picture of Elmo or a picture of, some mountains. And then there's the really tricky puzzles that have the tiny, complicated pieces. They don't all fit together exactly the same. You may have some that look like edge pieces that aren't really edge pieces. We've all put puzzles together like that. They can be really frustrating. That can be like that can be an example or an analogy of the weak market where information's just scattered about. Not everybody knows everything. It makes it a little tougher to figure out, how to navigate that kind of information to an outcome where you might win in the market, where you might choose the right stocks to invest in or the right ETFs, the right investment products to utilize to get your outcome that you're looking for.
Yeah, having kids, like you start with like those 4-piece puzzles, and when they're young, and you're like, this is easy, and then suddenly you get to the point where they can do it better than you when it gets further along. Yeah, and also just to tie this back to kind of my more nerdy quant part about this, the strong form is really everything is reflected, and that includes like inside information. So, most people, that doesn't hold in the real world for the most part. I mean, if I have inside information about something, typically I could profit from that. So that one has sort of been, most people don't think that's true.
Right.
And then the semi-strong would be, I can, if I have inside information, if I have non-public information, I can benefit from that. And then The weak one is all past price information is included in the price. And that, kind of indicates fundamental analysis might work, but technical analysis, our friends, the technical analysts, don't get too much love from the efficient market hypothesis.
No.
So that's kind of says, fundamental analysis might work, but technical analysis is not going to work. So that's kind of the nerdy definition. Now, Matt, I'm sure you have some sort of, real world cultural thing you can bring into this.
I think it's the matter of you're accepting who has what information, how and when does that apply, and how and when does it matter.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what you said about losing it, go fish, and this is just the reality of things. Maybe you should be playing with all the cards out. The reality is you don't have it all, they don't have it all. I love the puzzle analogy, Jess, because it reminds us that there's different situations where these apply. And I think that's like the fruit salad example, which is silly. But when we think about, because this shouldn't just apply, we're talking about it as it applies to stock markets and everything else. But think about it how it applies to the job market. Think about how you think about it with a marketing strategy or a marketing fail or whatever else. There's examples of this where various amounts of information are known by everybody or known by very few people. And it's really useful to understand that in different little sandboxes, these advantages can play out in meaningfully different ways. So it's worth having a theory that ties them all together.
So the next one is actually where we're going to get a little bit more on the complicated side. But this is something, all of us, anybody who's took finance classes, learned way back in college, which is this idea of the capital asset pricing model. So how do you think about an understandable way to explain that?
So the illustration that came to mind for that one was just it's a balance equation, right? So with the capital asset pricing model, you're trying to find a balance of the right amount of stocks and bonds or whatever investments you're using to achieve this ideal return. And so the illustration that I used was, imagine a seesaw, right? If you've got a bigger kid on one side, it's going to tip to that side. And this aspect of physics, which most people learn at some point along the way, whether it's middle school or high school now, I don't know because they keep backing these ideas up. But if you can understand this idea of physics, then you can kind of anticipate, like you're going to see two kids. They're both going to get on the seesaw. You already have an idea of which kid is going to, like which way the seesaw is going to tilt. And so if you're using this kind of idea, mapping it over to finance, if you can take two stocks and you see which one aligns a little bit more with the market as a whole, or it tilts away from the market, in which direction it tilts away from the market, you're going to be able to kind of get a sense of how that could perform in relation to the market as a whole. So which way is the seesaw going to tilt when this stock gets added to my portfolio? Which way is it going to tilt if that stock gets added to my portfolio? If you understand how it is relative to the market, so is it, riskier than the market, less risky than the market, you can kind of see where it would fit in your portfolio and how it might help you achieve that overall return you're going for.
Yeah, this is something that kind of gets a bad rap in my world, but I think it's actually still great. And I think they still teach it like in college. And the reason it gets a bad rap is because if you actually get into the weeds about like actually testing this, it doesn't work. Like, higher beta stocks, which is a measure of risk, don't outperform lower beta stocks. But why I think it's great is it gets at the relationship between risk and return. Mm-hmm. And that matters so much is, the idea that if I want to get a better return, if I'm in an efficient market and I want to get a better return, I'm going to have to take some more risk. And so I think that's, I think CAPM like really has a place in the world, even if people like me can test it and say, well, it doesn't hold up, because it gets at that key definition, which I think is a huge part of learning about investing.
You have to have the assumptions. Like this is the beauty of all this stuff is it literally is saying you need to have an assumption first. If I put, no offense to the fat kids, if I put the fat kid on the seesaw and there's a little tiny skinny Matt on the other side of it at like 8 years old, we know what's going to happen and we have that assumption. But in comic book universe, we can play with those assumptions and have something else play out. If you have no assumptions to start from, which if nothing else, this is the value of these theories. It gives you an assumption set to start from. So the CAPM says, well, I'm thinking about adding this stock to my portfolio. What do we think and why should this matter? I'm thinking about, this kid going to that college versus this kid going to another. Why do I have any assumptions about this and why should this matter? This is handing us a construct to actually start to make sense of that stuff. Doesn't mean we're predicting the future per se, but it does mean we actually have a way to start to say what's right or what's wrong when the future finally plays out.
And I think the other thing too is the idea that it brings in not just the risk of an individual asset, but how that risk correlates with the market. With a factor like beta, that's really important too, because it's an important concept to understand that, just looking at, if I'm adding something to my portfolio, just looking at it on its own doesn't tell me everything I need to know. I need to know also, how is that going to interact with my portfolio? If it's something that's always going up when my portfolio is going down, it might be very volatile, but it might help me. And so like, I think this also gets at that point, and I think it's helpful to learn it from that perspective as well.
Assumptions relative to the benchmark. I think that's the huge part here. It's not just that we have the assumption, I think this will cause that. It's this will cause that in relation to this other thing.
Correct.
That's a pretty profound and heavy thought.
So Jess, the next one gets a little bit more complicated, or at least your explanation doesn't, but the idea gets a little bit more complicated. Now we're actually getting into Fama and French's papers, and I don't know if you guys have read them. I read part of them, and it can be very hard to understand. But
A lot of tables,
I think
those two. A lot of tables.
What's that?
A lot of
A lot
tables.
of tables.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of
tables.
tables and a lot of
data.
fancy formulas and a lot of stuff. But the ideas actually aren't that complicated, and you did a really good job of boiling it down here. So how did you explain the Fama and French three-factor model?
I think the first thing to do is to determine or discuss like what is a factor. And we talk about this a lot at Alpha Architect. Like factors are just characteristics. And if you get into Fama's papers, French's papers, what you end up finding is there are a lot of characteristics in the investment world, but he really felt like they distilled down to a few that really mattered. And they mattered, this three-factor model was a outworking of his theory that more than just regular market ideas mattered, in the sense of like companies, their what looked good for a company on the books. There were things about those companies that mattered that kind of affected their overall performance beyond that. So for me, that's like if you are baking cookies, right, and you want to get to the best cookie, or you're looking for the best recipe for those cookies, like there are things that matter beyond flour and sugar in those cookies. Like maybe if you added chocolate chips, or if you added nuts, or if you've looked really deeply into these recipes, you can find out that if you add more butter, you get a different kind of cookie. If you add more sugar, you get a different kind of cookie. And so like all of these different ingredients, even beyond the basics, still some of them really do matter.
Yeah, and thinking about this like from an academic perspective, we had CAPM, we had this one risk factor that we tried to use to explain stock returns. It didn't work, as I referenced before. Well, now we have to look at what are these other characteristics? What are these other things that are out there, these other risk factors that might help us better explain stock returns?
Mm-hmm.
And so when they added in size and they added in value, they get to something that explains stock returns better than the CAPM did. I think the other important point with this is we're using the word risk factor. And that gets back to what we talked about before with the efficient market hypothesis. The idea is if the market's efficient, the reason things like value give you an excess return is because they are riskier. They are risk factors. And we'll talk about other things with anomalies and stuff later. But I think that's also something important to keep in mind is I'm getting, in these types of models, I'm getting a better return from value or from size or from anything like that because they are risk factors.
So apart from cookie recipe tips, which I'm already earmarking the time on this so I can go back. Are we pro adding potato chips to chocolate chip cookies, Jess, or anti in your household?
Did not realize this is an option.
Yeah. This is a thing.
Okay,
You want that
now
salt?
I'm
and that
making
crunch.
notes.
Have you done this,
Okay.
Matt?
All right.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we don't mess around over here.
Okay.
So my introduction to portfolio construction and three-factor model testing came in the form of the original Nintendo ice hockey game. Did either of you partake in this joyous creation?
I did a long time ago.
So if you remember, the portfolio construction, by which I mean team construction in this game, consisted of you could make your team, and it could consist of basically the fat and slow player, the skinny and small and fast player, or the mid and mid player. And depending on how you stacked your team would determine what to do. And so instinct would say like, oh, I should focus on spreading the factors out across my team. But fun in portfolio construction consists of like, can my little scrawny, tiny guy fast team beat the big dumb and slow team and whatever else? And so what three-factor tells us is that in different composition in different things, depending what we're competing against, if we're trying to beat a benchmark or do whatever else. It gives us an actual framework to think through, how does this team, how does this stacking of different types interact with each other? And again, if you have no framework, how are you supposed to make sense of some of the decisions you're making? This is a pretty profound thought to say we have 3 factors to explain the performance of this team, and now we can make predictive assumptions about what's going to go on. That's way more than just a Nintendo game, a great Nintendo game, but really, really interesting to think about that way.
What was the Matt? What was the best way to build the team? I'm wondering if there's anything I can learn about factor investing from the best way you constructed this team.
So the best way to have the team is you need at least one of like the big guys, and then if memory serves, it was basically just avoid the mids. Like the mids do nothing for you, so you want like either to try to dominate with a couple of really fast guys or whatever else. Now, if you're playing it as my brother and I, you quickly get bored of this. And then one of you is like, what if I'm all slow and big and you're all fast and small? And you start to just figure that out. And then because I'm the older brother, I always win anyway. And he develops a complex that carried him into adulthood. So hopefully therapy can fix that. I think that's the answer.
So as you can probably tell, Jess, we get off track in these things pretty frequently. So I got to, without Justin here, we don't have anybody to rein us back in. So we could end up on all kinds of rabbit holes, but I will try to do the job. Your next one was also very good. And it sort of alludes to something we already talked about, which is this idea of risk factors, but you expanded it a little bit. So this idea of factor investing, what's a simple way to explain that?
Yeah. So kind of to your point, Matt, on that Nintendo game, I didn't play the ice hockey game, but I did play Contra with my brother. And
up, down, left, right,
up, down. You know where I'm going with this, right?
So,
with factor investing, again, back to those characteristics, the idea was that we're going to isolate these characteristics as something that could generate returns during years when the market at large may not be giving us the return that we were looking for. And so it was like having special power inside your portfolio. So if you in that game, up, down, left, right, AB plus or AB.
BABA. If you want
select start. Thank you.
Yeah.
It's been a minute since I've used that one. Those special powers, right, would give you the opportunity to win a game. You could come from behind after giving that special power to your character. And so you could be on the losing streak, and then that one thing about the game would give you that edge that you needed in order to win. And so the idea behind factor investing is if you can eliminate and identify and utilize those special powers when you need them, it could help your portfolio overall. Even if it's behind, even if the market return isn't where it needs to be in order for you to be able to continue on this distribution rate that you've been using, these other factors added to your portfolio could perform during those periods of time to give you what you need and to keep you financially secure.
How do you think about how investors should view factors? It's something I struggle with all the time. Like to some extent, we go back to the efficient market hypothesis. Indexing is a great solution for a lot of people. But then I also look at the kind of stuff we do and the kind of stuff you do, and you say these factors do generate an excess return over time, but you've got to be behaviorally the right person to be able to use them. So like, how do you think about that? Like, who should use factors?
As you mentioned, like someone with an appetite, without an appetite for any sort of variability from the benchmark, is not going to be a good fit for factor investing, because you are going to see a lot of that. And what that means is like the benchmark is just really what you think it should be. And I actually made a post about this yesterday. If your benchmark is your neighbor's cousin's, son's, daughter's, mom's portfolio that you are comparing your portfolio to, that is your benchmark. And so identifying what the benchmark is for you, what matters to you, what you're trying to at least perform as well as and potentially outperform is kind of the first piece of that. But a lot of people look at the S&P 500, the market at large. That's what a lot of the conversations are around. And so if that's your benchmark and you can't really tolerate being below that during periods of time whenever the market is surging, when the S&P is doing well, when those Mag 7 are going to the moon, right? Then you're going to have a hard time with factor investing, because it is going to lag during periods of time when the Mag 7 are doing well. But during the period of time when those Mag 7 really are not holding up the performance you need, especially if you're in retirement and you're pulling, several $1,000s out of your portfolio every month, you may want to consider at least figuring out how to have an appetite for some of these additional factors and including that in your portfolio so that you can continue to generate the returns you need to be able to pull that, several $1,000s out of your portfolio every month, regardless of what the market at large, what the S&P 500 is doing. So it's kind of a push and pull, some education, some willingness to trust maybe the advice of your advisor on including some ideas that could generate these returns during times when the market are down. But really, it's just, what can you tolerate? Can you tolerate some deviation? Because these factors are definitely going to bring it during periods of time.
Yeah, I think you were spot on with that. Like one of the things I've learned is I think judging people relative to how much they care about benchmarks is a great thing to determining whether they're going to factor investing is going to work for them.
Yeah.
If there's somebody that cares a lot about benchmarks, if there's somebody that cares a lot like about the benchmark of the S&P 500, I'm more referring to, not like a properly constructed, benchmark behind the scenes, because most people don't even know what that is. But like if they're going to go to the cocktail party, they're going to see their friends in the S&P 500, or they're going to see their friends that bought Solana or whatever, and that's what they're going to compare themselves to. Factor investing may not be a great fit. But if they understand like what they're trying to do long term and they understand, how to properly judge it, then it is, I think. I think that's sort of a good way to look at it.
I think the behavioral value of factors is so often less about the investment and more about the investor.
Yeah.
For all those reasons. Because if the investment is just a market factor, great. If I know I'm comparing myself against the S&P 500, then that market factor is as much as about the investor who has to stick with it as it is about the investment choice itself. If I can choose deviation, if I can choose to self-flagellate in small cap value, hi, my little Roth, I see you out there struggling, but we'll make it. Like if you can handle that and you want that and you want to make that choice, again, it's as much about the investor as it is the investment itself. So the behavioral identification of these factors, it's super important, but it's really about what can you stick to.
Have either of you guys like come up with some good ideas in terms of how to help investors with this? I mean, Jess, Wes is really good about this in terms of, Wes has kind of flipped the script in terms of the way people sell stuff. Like Wes will be very, very open and upfront about like, if you buy our focused ETFs, here are the horrible things you're going to have to endure in order to get this return, which is great because people used to do it the opposite way and people kind of got surprised by it. And I think in a lot of ways that's probably a great technique to do it. But do you have any other ideas about what you think the best ways are to maybe get the right people on board for these kind of things?
Yeah, I mean, it is sort of a lowball approach, right? To say this could be really bad. You need to be okay with it being really bad in order for it to potentially deliver you with the returns that you're looking for over time. I mean, parenting is definitely one of those scenarios where the more you experience as a parent, the more you realize or I guess the further out your tolerance bands go for what could be deemed as generally acceptable child behavior. And so it really just, it is that idea of expectations that have to be determined and set forth and talked about as explicitly and as much as possible with the investor. The better you can be at setting those expectations. One of my favorite quotes around this is expectations minus reality equals your experience and your happiness. So if you have high expectations and your reality isn't really great, or reality minus expectations, I got that backwards. Reality minus expectations is going to be your happiness. And so if your reality with your portfolio is pretty bad, the expectations were high, then you're going to be on the downside of that happiness factor. And I think that applies very well to your investment portfolio and the expectations that the advisor should be setting around the experiences that you're going to have with that and with that model.
The next one you did is I think one of the biggest lessons people can learn, which is, all of us want to sit here and look at the 3-year track record, the 5-year track record of whatever's out there and say, all right, that tells me everything I need to know about the investment strategy. I just want to buy the stuff that's doing well over these periods, and that performance is going to persist in the future. And, it doesn't usually work out that way. So what was your way of explaining persistence of performance?
Yeah, I mean, everybody just wants it to go up and to the right? Like we just only want to pick winners. But the example that I used in this was just the horse racing example. And we can have, we assume that everybody out on the racetrack, or all the horses out on the racetrack and their riders, we assume that they are professionals, that they understand their skill and their craft and their talent well, and that they are going to do their best to perform. And at the same time, it doesn't necessarily mean that the same horse or the same skilled rider is going to win each time. And that's because elements are different. Like the rest that the horse has had, the sickness that the horse or the rider have had, the luck with where they were seated and where they started from. All of those things impact the outcome of that horse race. And so just because we've picked a stock that's done well in the past doesn't always mean it's going to do well in the future. Just because it's won a lot of races doesn't mean that the horse is always going to win those races into the future. And that's just because of things that we can't anticipate and don't know, and can't always keep consistent from time to time, from market time period to market time period, or from race to race in the case of the horse.
And I think this is one of the things investors get wrong a lot is, and this is something, I don't know if it was true of you too, but I learned when I got in the factor investing space, is how long a period you truly need to judge performance. Not 3 years, it's not 5 years, it's not really 10 years. Like Meb Faber talks all the time about how it's really like 20 years. And so that inconsistency between that and the way people typically judge performance, which is way in here, is where we end up with so many problems in investing, is people not understanding how long of a period you really need to judge performance.
I think you nailed it with the races, plural, and the idea that you have different starting conditions and different finish lines all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And if there's anything from the advisor seat that we're trying to do in matching up investment strategies to the individuals, it's, what you said 3 months ago or 6 months ago, not necessarily in like your long-term assumptions, but the starting conditions are always changing. The horses and the riders are always changing. The finish lines are always changing. And you have to be flexible to that. Inside of it, on just like we try to extrapolate this again away from just the investing side and think about it on the personal side, we think a lot about how do we just, it sounds dumb, but how do we lower expectations? And not just lower expectations on what we can achieve in a career or in retirement or in the fun activity we want to do with our kids or with our grandkids when they come visit us in the nursing home, because they will, but how to raise ambitions at the same time as you lower expectations. So be ambitious in the things that you're going to go out there and do for what you can control, because if my expectations of the other races or the other racers and what's going to happen, if I can lower those by raising my ambitions, by raising my emotional investment in the things I can control, hopefully I'm going to have a happier outcome. And even if my little Roth with its small cap value fund is like having its druthers, I can go, great, another year's come around. I can make another contribution. Let's see if this is the lucky time that, Seabiscuit is going to race ahead.
I love you bringing in Seabiscuit, Matt. Very impressive.
Channel your inner Seabiscuit, Jack. That's the lesson for today.
I don't know how to do that, but I'm going to give it a shot.
Give it a shot.
So the next one seems a little complicated on the surface, but you did a good job of explaining it. And that's this idea of transaction rationality. So can you explain that one?
Yeah, sure. I think the hardest part about transaction rationality is whether or not you actually trust the markets in general. And so the analogy for this one was simple. Let's just think of a big group of friends playing a game. Let's just call it Monopoly, right? Everybody's trying to win, but they're all playing fair and following the rules. So nobody's like stealing money from the bank. Nobody's flipping, trading cards behind their backs. Like,
this is not the Monopoly we played in my house.
So I think honestly, and that's the problem, right? Like life experience tells you that people don't always play fair. And so you come into this scenario with this embedded assumption that somebody somewhere is trying to disrupt for their advantage. And when it comes to stock markets, like while that possibility does exist, I think there's also at the same time a combined respect for how markets work and how it's produced returns and benefits for our society at large up to this point. And for the most part, everybody involved wants to continue to see that persist into the future. So this idea behind it is we're really all here trying to continue to see and we want to expect this same scenario to play out for us into the future. So we're all coming into it as honestly as we can.
Yeah, and just this idea that I think it's good to look at everything as being done rationally, even though sometimes it's not. It's good to think about that from that perspective, because sometimes what's rational to you is not what's rational to another person.
Right.
And if I sit here and use my own rationality to judge the decision of someone else, I may get myself into a bad place. And a good example of that, like if you think about people who grow certain kind of crops, they typically will hedge the price of those crops, like in the futures market or something, and they'll do that knowing that they're going to lose money on the hedge. So it doesn't seem like a rational thing, that this person keeps losing money. But the reality is it is a totally rational thing to do, because they have this risk that they have to hedge. And so they're making a rational decision to give up some return in order to hedge that risk.
Right.
It feels to me like it's the transaction rationality is less important than transaction repetition. That's my takeaway for this one. It's the market can be rational. The market can be irrational. People can put their thumb on the scale. The Hunt brothers can corner the silver market. What we have faith in with markets, though, is the repetition of transactions will correct these things eventually.
Yep.
In a recession, what's the bear market thing? Good money being returned to its rightful owners or whatever. Like, this is the idea. Repetition produces some sense of rationality over some greater time scale. Markets are one mechanism to enforce that. I will get off my, free market soapbox now.
Love that.
Well, thank you for doing that, Matt. So the next one is another term you'll hear a lot related to factor investing, which is this idea of a market anomaly. So what was your story to explain that one?
Yeah, that's super straightforward and easy. I was actually at a Dairy Queen as a kid. My family was there. And my sister, who seems to always be the one with the luck, was under the table on the floor of Dairy Queen, which everybody at this point should vomit. Like, that is just not the place to be. But while she was down there, she found a $100 bill. And our family, being the family they are, they reported it to the manager. The manager called a week later. Nobody had come back to claim their $100 bill. So my sister went home with, the new owner of $100. And this is probably just a little tell of how I feel about the markets and life in general. But like, to this day, when I go into a Dairy Queen, I look under a table to see if there's a random $100 bill on the floor, because I still have this point of reference of that is the place where you could find a $100 bill. And I think people translate that real life experience sometimes over to the way that they think the market might work. And they find, their $100 bill in something that they did. And then while that's a cool surprise, it's probably never going to happen again. I've never since that moment found a $100 bill under a table at a Dairy Queen. But I still look for it, right? And so they still have this kind of feeling or this pinpoint of that could happen to me if I just replicated this scenario one more time. And it's just an anomaly. It's not something that is maybe ever going to happen again. It was a temporary opportunity for you, but take that and move on, go back to the way that the markets normally work.
Yeah, and this kind of relates back to factor investing in that, you hear the terms anomaly and factor used. And kind of the way I think about it, we just had two academics on the podcast where we talked about it. Like, I kind of think about anomaly as like a behavioral thing. And I think about factor as kind of a risk thing. So, and what happens is the risk-based things tend to be more persistent. You tend to be more confident that they're going to continue over time. Whereas the anomalies, like you said, maybe I found this thing, but maybe it won't continue working in the future. Like, if this anomaly exists in the market, people are going to cheat, people are going to get rid of the arbitrage and the anomaly is not going to exist anymore. So I think it's interesting how it relates to factors from that perspective. Like, if we go back to the beginning when we talked about risk factors, if value is a risk factor, people like me, I think, would tend to think it's more persistent, or I have more confidence in the future than if it's purely driven by something like an anomaly.
So I had this weird experience that was not a Dairy Queen experience, but it is down the street from a Dairy Queen. So I feel like this is apropos with the bank, actually. So there was this bank down the street from one of the houses that we grew up in, and two anomalies of this bank. The first anomaly is this horrible feeling that if take yourself back to like 2000, I go through the ATM drive-through in the car. I go to take out $20. I'm not distracted by a smartphone. I don't know what I'm distracted by, probably the music or something. I drive away. I have my card and I realize I don't have the $20 bill I just took out. Oh. And I realized like right away, Like I'm halfway down the block and I'm like, there's no $20 bill. So I turn around and I go back and there's nobody there and there's no $20 bill there, like sitting there blowing in the wind. And this is probably before they beeped at you and yelled at you or whatever, and like the machine, or made you take the cash before your card or whatever they do now. But it was one of those where I like was just like, well, that sucks. That's not a $100 bill sitting below, the glorious Dairy Queen counter or whatever. But it is one of those things where I gave somebody free money, and that always just felt like I didn't even get to see him enjoy it. And I was like 18. So that really sucked. Now, same bank. Fact. I go into the bank one day. I don't remember if I was opening an account or what I had to do, but have you guys done the thing where you search either for clients or for yourself of, do you have any unclaimed property? Have you ever done that?
Yeah.
This is a thing. I forget the website, but you can go out and look and see if you have unclaimed property in a state. Maybe I got a letter first. Somehow I end up, and this is, Jack, kind of like to your point of like, what's the anomaly? That's just a random thing that happens versus what's a good idea. So I had gotten, I don't know, communion money or something like when I was 12, and good mom and dad take me to the bank and we open an account. So here I am at like 20 years old and getting notified that I had put like $100 in this bank account 10 years ago, totally forgot about it. And until it like earned enough interest to report a tax statement or something, I had never even heard about it. And so all of a sudden I had a bank account with like a couple $100 in it, which was way more valuable than the $20 I stupidly gave away by driving away from the ATM. But the important lesson there is like the behavioral lesson is, if I could take money and not touch it, it might actually grow and serve a purpose down the road. So these anomalies exist. They're always sneaking up on us, but we have to recognize them as that. If you can't replicate the thing, leaving your money in the ATM, finding $100 under the table, don't bet on that. Get it out of your assumptions. But if you can figure out there's a behavioral solution, forgetting you had money in an account and it grew, well, that's the kind of stuff you can actually architect into your plan. I didn't use that word intentionally, but I'm going to claim I used it intentionally. And that's the way I think about anomalies. You got to figure out the ones you can ring fence into your favor and focus on those.
Yeah. On that unclaimed property thing, like I get so excited. I don't know if you guys see it. Ned Favor does that tweet every year where he like puts the link up to the unclaimed property thing. And I'm going in there. I'm like, I'm going to find something. And every year it's zero.
I'm pretty sure next time I'll find out I owe somebody money if I go into that. That's the only outcome that can happen.
I think I'm like too obsessively organized, because I just there would never be an account floating out there that I somehow forgot about. But like I did look at my family members who are not obsessively organized, and there were accounts. So I found them money, although I found myself nothing.
There's always something.
So this next one is actually, I think, one of the most important things to learn in investing. And, to intro it, like I have to go back to the story of 2003 Jack. So 2003 Jack like started in the world of factor investing, like in the best year you could possibly start in the world of factor investing. Like 2003 was one of those years that basically, if you had any exposure like to size and value, so if you had, relative to market cap weighted indexes, if you had smaller companies, if you had cheaper companies, you were producing like 2 and 3 times the return of the market, basically by being dumb and doing nothing. So my problem was I thought I was doing something. I didn't think I was dumb and doing nothing. I thought I was doing like crazy smart things. And so like, I didn't learn as much as I should have. I wasn't continuing to update my strategy at that point. I wasn't continuing to learn around new things that were going on, because I just thought I was the greatest thing in the world. And then obviously eventually in this life, you get humbled and you realize you're not. So how did you explain this better than my story, I'm sure? How did you explain this idea of continuous learning?
Yeah, well, to your point, to your story, like the Dunning-Kruger effect always comes to mind whenever I'm thinking about whether or not I know enough in the world of investing. I get to this point where I think I know it all, and then all of a sudden I have a moment of reflection, or some asteroid hits my world of knowledge and I realize actually I know nothing, and then I have to kind of start that learning curve all over again. And I think there's a lot of people who feel this is the reason why people feel investing is unapproachable to them, is because there's just no way that you can learn everything that you need to know in order to really feel like you have the best understanding possible of how markets work and how finance works. And so especially for the common investor, like there's just too much. And so But it doesn't mean that we can relieve ourselves of the burden of searching for that knowledge, and also, very importantly, be careful about where that knowledge and information is coming from. And so I think the default way for a lot of investors and a lot of folks to learn about markets and to learn what's going on in the markets is just to watch the news or to turn on their favorite news channel in their car. And the problem with that is that there is also this aspect of news where they only make money if they sell the story, if people are listening and tuning in. And so we've had this competing kind of interest in news and in media to just sell the thing that people want to hear or sell the thing that most eyes will turn their attention toward. And so the problem with where you're sourcing your information is if there's this embedded idea that they want more eyes, they want more marketing, they want more attention on their story. So, the way that I laid this out was, kind of just the process of going through school. Like you start in kindergarten, you learn basic things like counting and reading. And then as you get older, you learn more advanced subjects. When you graduate from school, like learning doesn't stop. You go to college, you start to really dive in on specific subjects that are meaningful to you, that you feel like can help you translate your gifts into the world. And so thinking about investing from this perspective and starting on the basics of investing is really, to me, the ideal place to start if you are coming at this from the perspective that I don't know enough. Like, start where you are. Think about where you might be in your journey of understanding the investment landscape and start with the basics. Start with understanding what stocks and bonds are. Start with understanding how they relate to those in the market, to each other in the market. Like, start with those very basic concepts and add to it, as opposed to starting with the thing that may be most available, which is going to be your local news.
Yeah, on that point, like, there's one of the problems with like social media and with everything we have these days is like there's so much information out there, and so much of the information is not right. And so when an investor is kind of coming up from the beginning trying to learn, they can quickly get steered completely down the wrong path. Like,
Yep.
there's this ad that keeps showing up on my Twitter, which is something along the lines of this guy that says like, I'm a certified stock and options trading specialist. Come get my latest stock, my latest options ideas or whatever. And I'm like, first of all, there's no such thing as a certified stock and options trading specialist. So he's completely made that up. Like that, I don't know, Matthew, that certification I do not believe exists.
I have that certification. I'm pretty sure. That's just fine. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't mention that this tweet actually was from Matt. But
sorry.
But anyway, there's just so much stuff like that out there, and it's hard when you're trying to learn. No matter what level you're at.
Yeah.
And even like you work with Wes and guys like Jim O'Shaughnessy, like they are learning, like they're admitting things they don't know, so they can be way up here in their learning. You can be way down here in your learning. Like you said, it's about understanding where you are and trying to advance yourself, to the next level, and trying to take in the right information to do that, and not take in my certified stock and options trading specialist along the way.
Yeah. A big tell for those folks is how much do they tell you that they don't know versus how much do they tell you that they do know. And the ones that you want to lean into are the ones who are very forthcoming with what they don't know on the front end.
I think that's right. I think that's a big difference between like the guys that make it, or the guys and girls that make it 10 years versus 30 years, is like the ones that make it 10 years can be overconfident, but like eventually that gets to you. Like I was listening to a great interview that Chris Davis did on the Farnham Street podcast, which is great. It's like 3 hours long, but like you can tell, like he's had longevity. He's been through everything, and he was talking about what he doesn't know constantly throughout the whole interview. And like that's the difference, I think, that gets you to the next level, is when you're willing to admit, what I don't know, and you're willing to go out and try to learn what you don't know. I think that's the big separator.
There's this concept that I reference often. The first time I heard it, I fell in love with it. I haven't been able to get it off my mind since. And this is this idea of virtuosity. And it was introduced to me through CrossFit, actually. And Greg Glassman, who was the founder of CrossFit, was talking about how, at a gymnastics meet, for example, there's this panel of judges, and each of those judges have this score that they can give to the athlete after their performance. And that it is nearly impossible to get a score of 10, which would be the highest perfect score. And the reason for that is that the way to go from 9.7 to a 10 is this idea of virtuosity. And what that idea distills down to is how flawless are the basics of their performance. So they can get to a 9.5 through individuality and through skill and through the mastery of the complicated nature of this routine that they've just performed. But the way to get from 9.5 to a 10 or a 9.7 to a 10 is through demonstrating that they can do the basics uncommonly well. So showing the judges that the basics of movement that have been embedded into gymnastics are things that they can do better than anyone else in their field. And so it's this idea of doing the common uncommonly well. And I think that's something that is lost sometimes in the idea of investing, is that instead of doing the common uncommonly well, we try to get into the world of complication and we try to make this as difficult as possible. And then we lose sight of the ability to actually execute on the ideas that we brought into the mission to begin with.
And I think that fits pretty well into this next one, which is doing the common uncommonly well, which is emotional discipline, which is something like all of us, no matter how good we are at investing, we have to be able to do this well to be successful. So what was your method of explaining that one?
So this one I laid out as a game of musical chairs. And as you're going through musical chairs, if you've ever played this game before, which I don't know how you've avoided if you haven't, as you're going around, obviously you're listening to the music and you're waiting for that moment and trying to anticipate that moment when the music stops so that you are in front of a chair that no one else is in front of, so that you can vacate, or you can inhabit that chair. Like that will be your chair. It will be no one else's. And as they start to take chairs away from this game, you feel a little more anxious that like maybe I'm not going to be in front of that chair. And so the stock market sometimes can feel like that game of musical chairs, in the sense of like when there's a panic buying or panic selling, you're trying to get out of these positions, especially on that day trading kind of mentality of the market, where if something is good, I have to buy it now, or if something is bad, I have to sell it now before anyone else does, so that the value doesn't increase or decrease without me being able to manage that for myself. Like that panic, rush decision-making approach to the market leads to and can lead to mistakes. So the important piece of that one is just defining your landscape, or maybe the timeline of when you need to invest, when you might need to start the decumulation process, or the process of pulling your investments out to cash, and being really objective and very systematic in your way of approaching investments. Having that kind of discipline piece of, I get up every morning and I brush my teeth, the same kind of approach to the market or to buying stocks or purchasing investments in your model, as opposed to I'm going to get up and brush my teeth because I have bad breath. So it's not a reactive decision, but more of a disciplined process for the way that you're approaching this investment.
I love the perspective on this because it acknowledges the reality of sentiment in the decision-making process. And I think so often we lose track of how important sentiment is in the decision, whether that's sentiment internal to us or as a reflection on sentiment we're experiencing around us. Wanting to sell a stock because everything is crashing and burning, or wanting to buy a stock because everything is rushing forward. The Peter Atwater stuff is outstanding on this. He's got his confidence map. And in that, he basically says, if you have low control and low certainty, you're operating from a place of stress. So you probably don't want to make that decision until you've moved yourself out of that place of stress, which means you've either raised your control, and that might be as simple as the decision to click the button on your computer or whatever it is, or you've increased your certainty. So am I getting rid of this because there's new information that I go, I really don't want to hold this thing any longer in pure, markets and betting terms? Or is it something where as I start to zoom out, I can change the sentiment, I can change my comfort level with it. It might not be that I have a complete reversal in thinking, but it can track me back to what's the sentiment outside of this immediate time horizon. Because the reality is my portfolio is probably not trying to kill me today when something is happening or trying to make me a billionaire. The reality is probably there's been a gyration. Does this matter in my retirement plan? Does this matter in paying for my kids' college? Does this matter in my ability to purchase a home? Or, oh my God, my house value has gone so much in the last year. Okay, are you going to sell it? No. Okay. So
This is probably like one of the biggest learnings of my career, both from the perspective of myself and trying to improve my own emotional discipline, but also understanding that, I think at the beginning I built like factor strategies in like an academic world, where nobody's using them, and you kind of think about them like, all right, what gets the best return? Don't worry about anything else. And then you start doing it in the real world, and you realize like nobody has unlimited emotional discipline. You've got to either build your strategies in such a way that people can stick with them, or you've got to find the people and bring in the people that can stick with them. But you can't just take these kind of strategies and just throw them out to a random audience of people and expect them to stick with them. And you're going to achieve a worse outcome for those people than if they just bought an index fund or something like that, because they're going to panic, and they're going to, fear and greed and what you mentioned here is going to kick in, and they're going to make the wrong decisions. So like that's a constant battle, and it's something I'll never figure out completely. But, I think that's a really important thing to think about is it's not just about my emotional discipline. Like when I'm someone managing people's money, it's also about theirs and trying to match what I'm doing to what that is.
Yeah. Yeah. And back to those expectations. I mean, if you're playing a game of musical chairs and every time every time a round presents itself, only one chair gets taken away. And then all of a sudden you're down to the last 10 people and there's 9 chairs. And during that one song, continuous chairs just keep getting taken away. And all of a sudden you've changed the rules of the game you thought you were playing to where we've gone from 9 chairs down to 1 in the course of one song. Like you will see the affect of people in that room aggressively change. And so just continuing to also like be able to set expectations for your investors that you're working with, being able to anticipate maybe changes in the game so that you can bring those expectations to bear for them sooner than they're going to experience them, is a big part of this type of behavior management and emotional discipline that you're trying to also scale down and provide to the investors that are trusting you with this strategy.
This last one I think is a great one to wrap up on because it's something you see all the time. Like I do it myself. Like everybody wants to judge every decision, every investment on its own. So even if what I'm doing as a whole is working, I still want to pick apart the thing that's not working. And I want to say, well, what if I didn't do that? Like it'd be working even better if I didn't have that thing and I didn't make that decision, or if I didn't have that investment. So can you talk about a holistic approach and what your idea was of that one?
Yeah. So the example I used was riding a bike, and as you were talking, it was almost even something else came to mind is after you've crashed your bike and broken your elbow, like how many times do you go back and revisit that scenario and think, if I had just not done, if I had just not looked this direction, or if I had just had both my hands on this handlebars at that time that I hit that bump or hit that rock. And so, of course, a big piece of this, right, is just understanding that you only know what you know, and you can't ever have that hindsight kind of 2020 vision of what would be coming until you're past that moment. And so you do really just have to pinpoint that future goal or that future destination as the place that you're going to get to through, and trust that the strategy that you've chosen to get you there, it will actually get you there. So that when you do come to that next rock or bump in the road, you don't just bail the bike completely. You stay on it. You trust your ability to move through that kind of volatile moment with the strategy that you've chosen, because you know that if you get off the bike, you're never going to get to the place that you're trying to get to. So even though it's scary, even though you're going to feel a little nervous, probably at moments in the time, if you're staying focused on that long goal, if you are, tying yourself to the idea that you do need to eventually get to that place, this is the thing that will get you there. That will help you in your kind of short-term periods of discomfort that you may feel because your portfolio is a little volatile. It's moving around a bit, maybe in a way that you didn't expect or anticipate.
Yeah, the bike is a great example. And I was thinking like, people have this tendency to look at these individual things and start peeling off the individual things because they're not working. But like at a certain point, like if you don't ride a bike, you're not going to get the joy of riding a bike. You might get hurt, but at a certain point, you're in a white padded room by yourself, and you're sitting there and you're like, well, I'm never going to get sick. I'm never going to get hurt. This is going to be fantastic. And it's like the worst thing you could possibly do. So I think that was a good analogy from that perspective.
Reminding people you have to play this game. Like you have to get on the thing and take the risk to get to where you want to go. That's a huge part of it. We, my wife and I took a hike this weekend and we went to this, it's converted railroad tracks. And if my mom is listening, we never rode our bikes all the way up those railroad tracks to like 10 towns up. Never did that.
Never, Mom.
This was not a good bike riding path. And I still don't understand because it's like 2.5 miles of like low grade uphill, like on this thing. So I don't know how I did that on, a mid 80s BMX bike or whatever, but somehow, some way. So we walk up this thing and it's the reality of, well, they've taken the railroad tracks away. They've taken the rocky places away where you could almost die and you had to carry your bike over trickling water and things that were never safe on. And we get to the end of this trail and they've now mapped the trail behind these backyards that didn't used to exist. And where does the trail lead out right now? To a wonderful pizza restaurant that serves beer. And on like 3 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon, we're like, are we doing this? We're walking home downhill. We can eat pizza and beer before we go home. And whether it's on the bike or on the path, like knowing that destination awaits, and that's why you're actually doing it. Even when you don't know, you might get the anomaly of a great pizza restaurant and beer in a frosted mug.
Yeah, maybe the anomaly isn't the scary part.
Anomaly's not the scary part, at least not always. I got lots of stories about falling off bikes as a kid, but we're going to avoid those and bury those deep down.
Well, pizza and beer is probably a good place to wrap up.
Oh, wait. I'm not letting you end it there.
Oh, you're not done yet.
I resisted.
Are you going to bring the Skid Row in, or have you got something else?
I'm not bringing Skid Row in. This
You
is
could do 18 in the value factors, having 18 in life now or something, or you could go there if you wanted to.
I'm not going to lie. I did wake up this morning with this idea in my head that I have this like 20-part like complicated playlist explaining all the songs. I've abandoned them. But just as an example, if you would indulge me with a game, I'd like to prove out price discovery and the efficient markets hypothesis. Are you game to play my game?
More games. I love it.
Okay. So the question is, and you can blurt out the answer if you figure this out. If you can name the song, I'll give you the song, the artist, or where this famously appears. This is in special tribute to you, Jess. You already have points just on the board just because of how you showed up today for this. So if you can name the artist, the song, or where this appears, you win the game. I'll only give you a small snippet of this. I'm not going to sing it. I'm reciting it as spoken word poetry, as it ought to be. I watch with open eyes. I will give you more information as this goes, as hints. I watch with open eyes till it's time to take it all away. Hey, every day, the game is ours to play. Oh, tell me why there are no alibis. 'Cause winner takes it all. Loser takes a fall. Fight to the beginning of the end. Winner takes it all till he breaks the fall. In time, he'll make it. Does anybody know yet? Last hint if you don't know it yet.
I don't.
Okay. This is the clue. He'll make it over the top. Anybody. The movie, at least. This is the clue. Do we have it?
Over the top. Is this a Sylvester Stallone movie?
Jack, I think you
Isn't that
want
the
our
arm
game.
wrestling movie he did or something?
Yes.
Okay.
The lesson in Over the Top, starring Sylvester Stallone, with the song Winner Takes It All by Sammy Hagar, is that you get your superpower when you put your hat on and turn it around backwards. Jess, we assume this is where you get your powers from. Thank you so much for being our guest today.
Thanks for having me.
Hi guys, this is Justin again. Thanks so much for tuning into this episode. You can follow Jack on Twitter at @PracticalQuant. You can follow me on Twitter at JJCarbino and follow Matt on Twitter at @CultishCreative. If you found this discussion interesting and valuable, please subscribe in either iTunes or on YouTube, or leave a review or a comment. Also, if you have any ideas for topics you'd like us to cover in the future, please email us at excessreturnspod@gmail.com. We would like this to be a listener-driven podcast and would appreciate any suggestions. Thank you.